The air in Ava's room hummed with quiet anticipation as she put the final touches on her history project. It was late, and the muted glow from her desk lamp cast a warm circle of light, framing the neatly typed pages she had spent hours on. Every detail of her assignment had been carefully researched, each word chosen to honor a name she felt everyone should know. Clara Rivers, a local civil rights activist whose story had all but vanished over time. Ava felt a surge of pride. This was more than just a project. It was a tribute. As she carefully slipped her work into a crisp, clear folder, Ava felt a small thrill. Tomorrow, her teacher, Mr. Wallace, would finally read the story of Clara Rivers, a woman who had risked everything to challenge injustice right in their town. Ava imagined Mr. Wallace nodding with approval, maybe even mentioning the story to the rest of the class. She could almost hear his voice, rich and resonant, as he acknowledged her work. The following morning, Ava entered her history classroom with a sense of hope, her folder clasped tightly in her hands. The room smelled faintly of chalk and old paper, the same smell it had every day, but today it felt different. She waited until everyone else had filed in, her heart beating a little faster than usual as she made her way up to Mr. Wallace's desk. He looked up from his own papers, his expression impassive. "Mr. Wallace," she began, holding out her assignment, "here's my project on Clara Rivers." His eyes glanced at the title page briefly before settling back on her, with a look she couldn't quite read. For a moment, she held her breath, expecting some small recognition or even a nod of approval. Instead, his lips thinned, and he placed her folder back on the desk between them. "I'm sorry, Ava, but I don't see the point in grading this," he said, his voice clipped and cold. Ava's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clara Rivers? Is this some local activist or something? I think it would have been better if you'd chosen a more relevant topic," he replied, shrugging as if it were a small, inconsequential matter. "Honestly, Ava, this isn't something I feel is important enough to be graded." His words felt like a slap. Ava's mind spun, her cheeks burning with a mix of shock and indignation. She managed a small, polite nod and took her project back, her fingers gripping the edges tightly. As she returned to her seat, her thoughts raced. Why had he dismissed her work so easily? She glanced around the room, where posters of famous figures from history hung on the walls. Figures who had shaped the nation, each in their own way. What made Clara Rivers any less worthy? Ava's gaze drifted back to Mr. Wallace, who had already moved on, shuffling through other students' assignments without a second thought. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mr. Wallace had never been openly rude or dismissive, but his reaction today left a nagging question in her mind. She resolved right then and there that if he wouldn't read Clara Rivers' story, she would make sure someone would. Ava sat in her room that evening, her project spread out before her, but her thoughts kept drifting to her grandmother's voice, calm and steady, like a lullaby of the past. Growing up, Sunday afternoons were spent in her grandmother's kitchen, where the smell of homemade biscuits and sweet tea filled the air. Her grandmother would sit by the window, her hands folded, telling stories about their family and the powerful lives of black men and women who had paved the way before them. It was her grandmother who had first told her about Clara Rivers, a local hero, she'd said with pride in her eyes. Clara's story had always struck a chord with Ava, not only for the courage Clara had shown, but for how easily her legacy had been erased, nearly lost in the fabric of time. These stories weren't just Ava's history. They were her passion, her way of making sense of herself in a world that often failed to recognize the contributions of people like Clara and like her own family. Ava's dreams were big, but they often felt like fragile things, easily overshadowed by the opinions of others. Her passion for history and journalism wasn't always understood. Sometimes her friends would give her that puzzled look when she talked about the importance of a legacy or how deeply she cared about preserving history. They'd support her, of course, but they didn't feel the same urgency she did. She'd often feel a pang of loneliness when they couldn't understand why she spent hours digging through old books and archives, or why she'd get so fired up over names and dates long faded from memory. The struggle was more than just not being understood. Ava had heard whispers and subtle remarks from teachers, classmates, even strangers, who seemed to think that her aspirations were a little too ambitious, a little too bold, for someone like her. She'd once overheard a teacher say, "Ava's bright, but she should focus on something more realistic," and the sting of that moment had stayed with her ever since. It was as if there was an invisible ceiling, a limit on her dreams that others seemed to see so clearly, but that she refused to accept. Her family, though, stood as her unwavering support. Her mother, who worked tirelessly as a nurse, and her father, a city bus driver who always reminded her to stand tall, no matter what. They both encouraged her, but it was her grandmother who instilled in her the fire to keep fighting. "You come from a line of resilient folks, Ava," her grandmother would say with a steady gaze. "You have a duty to tell our stories. If you don't, who will?" Now, as she sat holding the project that Mr. Wallace had so quickly dismissed, Ava felt that weight, the responsibility of honoring those who came before her. She wanted to be more than a high school student with a hobby. She wanted to make a real difference. But every now and then, doubt crept in, whispering to her that she was chasing shadows in a world that didn't care. Ava closed her eyes and took a deep breath, hearing her grandmother's voice in her mind. If she couldn't reach Mr. Wallace, she'd find another way. She knew that Clara Rivers' story, and all the stories like hers, deserved to be remembered. This was her journey, her duty, and no matter the obstacles, she'd find a way to keep those voices from being lost. Ava sat cross-legged on her bed, the faint light from her desk lamp illuminating the pile of papers spread before her. Clara Rivers' photograph was among them, a slightly grainy, sepia-toned image that had likely survived a few decades of neglect. Ava leaned in closer, her fingers brushing gently over the old photo, her mind still buzzing with frustration over Mr. Wallace's reaction. But beneath that frustration was a growing curiosity, an insatiable urge to understand why Clara Rivers' story seemed almost buried. The photograph of Clara was unassuming at first glance. A young black woman, standing confidently with her hands clasped before her, wearing a simple mid-century dress that hinted at a life of modesty. Ava studied Clara's face, her expression resolute yet warm, eyes shining with purpose. But something about the image struck her as odd. In the background of the photograph, just beyond Clara's left shoulder, was a faint symbol, a crest of some kind, faded with time but still recognizable. Ava squinted, adjusting the photo under the lamp to bring it into sharper focus. Her pulse quickened as she realized what she was looking at. It was the emblem of her own high school, the same emblem she passed by every day on the wall near the school's front entrance, engraved on the old brick facade. Ava's eyes widened. What was her school's emblem doing in a photograph of Clara Rivers? Her heart raced as questions flooded her mind. Had Clara attended her school? Or perhaps she held a rally or an event there during her time as an activist. Why hadn't Ava ever heard about it before? She had pored over local histories and read about countless civil rights events, yet Clara's connection to her own school had never come up. Ava's fingers traced the lines of the school crest in the photograph, as if hoping that touch alone could reveal the secrets it held. A sense of purpose began to replace her frustration. Mr. Wallace's dismissal was almost a gift in disguise, a challenge pushing her to uncover what he had so carelessly overlooked. The subtle connection between Clara Rivers and her school was too tantalizing to ignore, and Ava felt an unshakable resolve to find out why Clara's story had seemingly been erased. She leaned back, staring at the photograph, an odd feeling settling over her. It was as though Clara herself were staring back, urging her to dig deeper, to bring something long forgotten back to the light. The next day, Ava made her way to the school library during her lunch break. The dusty, dimly lit room was usually empty at this hour, save for Mrs. Hendricks, the elderly librarian who kept the stacks in order with meticulous care. As Ava pushed open the heavy oak door, the faint smell of aged paper and wood polish greeted her, wrapping her in the comforting embrace of countless stories and secrets waiting to be told. Ava approached Mrs. Hendricks, who was hunched over a small cart of books, carefully sorting them into piles. "Mrs. Hendricks," Ava asked, her voice soft but steady. The librarian looked up, adjusting her glasses with a faint smile. "Yes, dear. How can I help you?" "I was wondering if we have any records or old yearbooks from the 1960s. I'm doing some research on Clara Rivers, and I think she may have had a connection to our school." Mrs. Hendricks' expression shifted subtly, a flicker of recognition passing over her face. "Clara Rivers, you say?" "Yes," Ava replied, her excitement growing. "Do you know anything about her?" Mrs. Hendricks hesitated for a moment, her gaze drifting toward a locked cabinet near the back of the library. "Well, there are some old records from that time. Not many, but a few. They're in the archives. We don't usually have students going back there, but I suppose I can make an exception for you." Ava's heart leaped. She followed Mrs. Hendricks to the back of the library, where the older woman unlocked the cabinet and pulled out a small, leather-bound book along with a few dusty files. The book's spine was cracked, the gold lettering faded, but Ava could still make out the words, "Rivers High School Records, 1960 to 1969. Mrs. Hendricks handed her the items with a thoughtful expression. "These might help, though I should warn you, there isn't much in here. The records from that time were somewhat sparse." Ava thanked her and took a seat at a nearby table, gingerly opening the leather-bound book. The pages were fragile, yellowed with age, but as she flipped through, she caught glimpses of familiar names, teachers who had since retired, old sports teams, and various student events. About halfway through, she spotted a small, faded black-and-white photograph pasted onto one of the pages. It was Clara standing at the entrance of her school, holding the sign that read "Equal Rights for All." Ava's breath caught in her throat. This was proof that Clara had indeed been here, had stood on the very grounds that Ava walked every day. Her fingers trembled as she traced the image, feeling an inexplicable sense of connection to Clara's courage. But then she noticed something strange. Beneath the photograph was a caption, handwritten in neat script. "Clara Rivers, local activist, suspended indefinitely." Ava's stomach twisted. Suspended? Why would the school suspend someone who was fighting for equality? She dug deeper into the files, finding brief notes and mentions of incidents and disruptions, each word dripping with bias, as if the writer had viewed Clara's activism as a nuisance rather than a noble cause. But nowhere did she find any mention of what had happened to Clara after her suspension. It was as if she had simply vanished. Ava leaned back, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. There was more to this story, much more. The thought that her own school had played a role in silencing Clara's voice filled her with a strange mix of anger and sadness. She wondered how many other students had walked these halls, never knowing that a hero had once fought for justice right where they stood. Ava's investigation didn't end there. In the days that followed, she visited the town's historical society, combing through old newspapers and records in search of any information about Clara Rivers. The small building was cluttered with dusty file boxes and fading newspaper clippings, and Ava spent hours each day hunched over stacks of yellowed papers, scanning for Clara's name. Finally, one afternoon, she found an article dated April 1967. It was a small piece buried in the back pages of the newspaper, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. "Local activist Clara Rivers reported missing," the headline read. Ava's heart pounded as she read through the article. Clara had gone missing shortly after her suspension from school, her absence dismissed by authorities as a runaway case. The article suggested that Clara had simply left town, frustrated with the lack of progress in her activism. But Ava knew better. There was a darker story here, one that had been swept under the rug, and she was determined to uncover it. With each new discovery, Ava felt herself drawn further into Clara's life, her struggles, her hopes, and her fears. She could feel Clara's presence, like a faint whisper urging her on, guiding her toward the truth that had been hidden for far too long. But as Ava dug deeper, she began to notice strange things happening around her. Teachers who usually greeted her warmly started avoiding her gaze, their smiles stiff and forced. Mr. Wallace, who had dismissed her project so quickly, seemed to watch her with a wary eye, as if he sensed that she was getting closer to something he'd rather remain hidden. One day, as she was leaving school, she found a note slipped into her locker. It was written in hurried, shaky handwriting, as though the writer had been afraid of being seen. "Stop looking into Clara Rivers," it read. "Some things are better left buried." Ava's fingers tightened around the paper, her pulse quickening. This was no longer just about an old school project. It was something bigger, something dangerous. But instead of scaring her, the warning only fueled her resolve. If someone was so desperate to keep Clara's story hidden, then Ava was more determined than ever to bring it to light. That night, as she lay in bed, Ava stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with everything she had learned. Clara's story wasn't just history, it was alive, pulsing with the same injustices that still lingered in her own world. And as she drifted off to sleep, she made a silent promise to herself and to Clara. She would find the truth, no matter what it took. What began as a simple project had transformed into a mission, a journey to reclaim a voice that had been silenced for too long. And though Ava didn't yet know the full extent of the secrets she was about to uncover, one thing was certain. Clara Rivers' story would finally be told. As the last bell echoed through the empty hallways, Ava made her way to the school library with a determination she could feel buzzing through her entire body. The soft hum of fluorescent lights greeted her as she slipped through the aisles, her footsteps quiet and careful. She knew Mrs. Hendricks would let her stay after hours, but she didn't want to draw too much attention. Something about her search felt delicate, like handling the fragile threads of the story that was waiting to be pieced together. She settled herself in a secluded corner near the back, surrounded by shelves packed with dusty yearbooks, faded newspapers, and forgotten records. Ava started with the school's yearbooks from the 1960s, flipping through each page with careful fingers. Her mind kept drifting back to Clara's photograph, the determined look in her eyes, the school emblem in the background. Clara had been a student here, perhaps even a leader. Ava could feel it. As she turned a page, her eyes landed on a section labeled Student Organizations. A small group photo showed a mix of students gathered in front of the very same school entrance Ava walked through every day. She studied each face closely, her heart skipping when she spotted Clara on the far left, partially hidden behind a taller student. There she was, a quiet figure among her peers, yet there was something captivating about her presence. The caption beneath the photo simply read, Student Council, 1965. No mention of her activism, no note of the impact she'd made. It was as if her contributions had been erased. Ava leaned back, frustrated but more intrigued than ever. It wasn't enough to prove that Clara had been here. She wanted evidence of what Clara had fought for, the changes she had tried to bring. And that's when she noticed it, the school newspaper archives. Thick-bound volumes from decades ago were lined up neatly on a nearby shelf, organized by year. Pulling down one from 1965, Ava flipped through the brittle pages. The articles covered the usual student events, sports scores, pep rallies, homecoming dances. But as she turned to the back, her eyes landed on something different. It was an opinion piece, tucked away in the corner of the page, almost as if it were hidden. The title read, A Call for Change, and it was uncredited. Ava's pulse quickened as she read. The article detailed instances of racial discrimination within the school. Students being barred from certain events, unequal treatment in sports teams, derogatory comments from some teachers. The writer's words were bold, fierce, a passionate plea for equality. Ava's eyes skimmed to the bottom of the page, and that's when she saw it. Instead of a name, there was a small, hand-drawn symbol, a hand holding a pen. Her heart pounded. She recognized the symbol instantly. It was Clara's. Ava had seen it on one of the few photographs of Clara's protest signs during a civil rights march. The symbol was Clara's signature, her personal mark on everything she wrote or spoke for. Ava leaned back, exhilarated. This article was Clara's voice, her words reaching out across the decades. Ava spent the next hour combing through the newspapers, searching for more. And she found them. A string of opinion pieces scattered through 1965 and 1966, all of them tackling social justice issues within the school. They were all uncredited, but each one bore the same symbol, like a quiet rebellion hidden in the pages of the school's own publication. She could almost hear Clara's voice in each article, a voice both fierce and eloquent, calling out the injustices that her peers had chosen to ignore. Ava felt a mixture of awe and sadness. Here was a young woman who had given her all for change, only for her work to be forgotten. buried beneath the sands of time. But Ava couldn't shake a question that had been tugging at the back of her mind. Why hadn't anyone spoken of Clara's efforts? Why was there no recognition of her activism? Even in the local histories, Clara's name barely surfaced. Lost in thought, Ava didn't hear the soft footsteps behind her until a familiar voice interrupted her focus. "Ava, what are you still doing here?" She looked up to see Mr. Wallace standing in the doorway, arms folded, a faint look of suspicion in his eyes. Ava quickly closed the newspaper, forcing a smile as her mind scrambled for an excuse. "Oh, I was just, finishing some research for an essay," she replied, trying to sound casual. He raised an eyebrow, his gaze drifting toward the old newspaper lying open on the table. "That's quite a bit of effort for a simple assignment, don't you think?" Ava swallowed, sensing the tension in his voice. I just want to make sure I get all the details right," she said, hoping he wouldn't pry further. "I think there's more to Clara Rivers' story than what we know." Mr. Wallace's expression tightened. For a moment, she thought he was going to ask more, but instead, he nodded, a strained smile forming on his face. "Well, don't let it consume too much of your time," he said, his tone dismissive. "Some things are better left in the past." Ava watched him leave, a sense of unease creeping over her. His reaction felt odd, almost guarded, as if he knew something he didn't want her to uncover. It was more than just his usual dismissiveness, it was a warning. As soon as he was out of sight, she returned to the newspaper, her hands trembling with a mix of fear and determination. Ava knew she was onto something bigger than a mere school project. Each piece of evidence was pulling her closer to the truth, each article another thread in a tapestry Clara had woven with her words. And despite Mr. Wallace's warning, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's story was something that needed to be heard. A few days later, she found herself back in the archives, this time looking for faculty records. She wanted to know more about the teachers who had been around during Clara's time, who had supported her, who might have tried to silence her. As she thumbed through the old files, she found a faculty directory from 1965. Most of the names were unfamiliar, but one stood out. Mrs. Evelyn Green. Ava had seen that name in one of Clara's articles, an anonymous teacher who had reportedly spoken out against racial segregation within the school. Ava's curiosity piqued, and she wondered if Mrs. Green might still be alive. She scribbled down the name, making a mental note to follow up later. Ava's mind spun with possibilities. She imagined what it must have been like for Clara, facing opposition not just from students but from teachers and faculty. Each small discovery felt like opening a door into Clara's world, a world where she'd fought, spoken out, and perhaps paid the price. As Ava closed the last file, she caught sight of a faint writing on the inside cover, almost too faded to read. She squinted, bringing the book closer. It was another handwritten note, and though the letters were worn, Ava could just make out the words. "They silenced her once, but they can't silence us all." A chill ran down her spine. The message felt like a warning and a call to action all at once. Ava's curiosity had now transformed into a burning need for justice. Clara's voice was there, echoing through the years, and Ava knew she had to bring it back. Each clue, each small discovery, only strengthened her resolve. As Ava's investigation continued, she started noticing things around her shifting subtly, more than just old records and dusty archives. It was the people. Every time she passed Mr. Wallace in the halls, she felt his eyes lingering, a silent, heavy stare that made her feel like she was crossing a line, a boundary she wasn't supposed to see. The feeling was especially strong one afternoon when Ava entered his classroom during lunch to ask about an unrelated assignment. She was still mulling over the newspaper articles and wondering if she'd find anything about Clara in the faculty's old records. As she approached Mr. Wallace's desk, he barely looked up from the papers he was grading. "Can I help you with something, Ava?" he asked, his tone neutral yet somehow tinged with irritation. Ava cleared her throat, her mind racing with how to broach the topic without tipping her hand entirely. "I was wondering if you knew anything about the history of this school," she ventured, watching his face closely. "About any former students who made a difference, people like Clara Rivers." Mr. Wallace's pen stilled mid-stroke, and he finally raised his head to look at her. His expression was unreadable, a mix of surprise and something that almost looked like annoyance. "Why do you ask?" Ava shrugged, trying to keep her tone casual. "I just think her story is really interesting, and I think people should know about it." Mr. Wallace set his pen down with a sigh, folding his hands in front of him. "Look, Ava, I understand your interest, but not everything from the past needs to be brought up. Sometimes it's better to let certain stories rest." Feeling dismissed yet again, Ava left the office, her heart pounding with frustration. Every path she tried to take was blocked. Mr. Wallace, Principal Reed. Everyone seemed intent on stopping her from learning the truth. A tiny flicker of doubt started to creep in. Maybe they were right. Maybe some stories didn't need to be dragged into the light. But then, a quiet, almost whispering voice in her mind reminded her of her purpose. Clara's story was her story too, a legacy that belonged to her and her community. How could she let it be forgotten? Ava tried to push her doubts aside, but they lingered, clouding her thoughts. That evening, she sat alone in her room, flipping through the pages of her research notes. For the first time, she felt a heavy weight settle over her, a voice that asked, "Is this really worth it?" It was then that her phone buzzed with a text from her grandmother, as if sensing her distress. The message was simple. "Our stories are what keep us alive, Ava. Honor them." Ava's heart swelled, the familiar warmth of her grandmother's wisdom grounding her. Her grandmother had always taught her the importance of preserving history, of keeping the memories of those who had come before alive. With her support, Ava's determination reignited. She couldn't walk away now. Clara's story needed to be told, no matter how uncomfortable it made certain people. The following day, she confided in her friends about the obstacles she was facing. As she explained her run-ins with Mr. Wallace and Principal Reed, her friends listened with a mix of shock and anger. Why would they want to hide it? Her friend Mia asked, frowning. "It's like they're scared of the truth or something." Ava nodded. "That's what I think too. And that just makes me want to find out more." Determined to help, her friends offered to assist with the research. Together, they pored over more old newspapers, reaching out to local community members who might remember Clara. It was through one of these contacts, an elderly librarian named Mrs. Jenkins, that Ava received a lead she hadn't expected. After hearing Ava's story, Mrs. Jenkins told her about a letter she'd come across years ago while organizing archives. She described it as a letter Clara had written to a trusted friend, detailing the discrimination and harassment she had faced at school. Mrs. Jenkins had made a copy of the letter, feeling it was too important to leave hidden. The next day, Mrs. Jenkins handed Ava an envelope with the faded copy of Clara's letter inside. Ava opened it with shaking hands, her friends peering over her shoulder as they read the words aloud. "There are people here who don't want change, who see me as a problem they need to fix. They try to silence me, to make me feel small. But I know my voice is important, even if they try to hide it. If I stay quiet, who will speak for us? Who will tell our story? One day, people will understand that I wasn't a problem. I was part of the solution." Ava's heart pounded as she read Clara's words, feeling them resonate deep within her. It was as though Clara were speaking directly to her, urging her forward, challenging her to continue the fight she had started all those years ago. She could almost feel Clara's presence beside her, a courageous figure who had stood up when it wasn't easy, who had fought for justice despite the odds stacked against her. Tears stung Ava's eyes as she folded the letter, holding it close to her heart. This letter was the proof she needed, a testament to Clara's courage and resilience. It was more than a letter, it was a call to action. Ava looked at her friends, her voice steady but filled with newfound conviction. "We're not just bringing back her story," she said, her eyes fierce. "We're finishing what she started." The letter became Ava's guiding light, a reminder of why she was doing this. Clara hadn't just been a student who attended the school. She had been a trailblazer, a voice for the voiceless, and someone who refused to let her story be erased. As she left the library with her friends, Ava knew she was ready for whatever lay ahead, no matter the obstacles. She would honor Clara's legacy, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. Late one evening, the school hallways lay silent, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight seeping through the windows. Ava's heart beat loudly as she glanced around, clutching the borrowed key in her hand. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, an opportunity to access the restricted archive that might hold the answers she'd been searching for. With each step down the quiet hallway, Ava felt a mixture of excitement, anxiety, and anticipation coursing through her veins. She had spent weeks hitting walls at every turn, facing resistance from Mr. Wallace, the principal, and even her own doubts. But now, with her grandmother's words echoing in her mind and Clara's letter folded in her pocket, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her friends had done everything they could to help her up to this point, but tonight she was on her own. She knew they'd understand. This was something she needed to see for herself. As she turned the key in the lock of the small, seldom used storage room adjacent to the library, a faint click echoed through the empty hall. Ava took a deep breath and pushed the door open, stepping into the darkness. The smell of old paper and musty wood greeted her, along with the sight of towering shelves lined with neatly labeled boxes and folders, each containing pieces of the school's history. Somewhere in this room lay the story of Clara Rivers, a story buried and forgotten, but one that Ava was determined to bring back to life. Switching on her phone's flashlight, Ava began her search, moving slowly down the aisles and scanning the labels. Her fingers traced over decades' worth of dusty files and records, each one a potential key to Clara's story. Finally, she spotted a stack of old-school newspapers from the 1960s, bound together by fraying strings. Her pulse quickened as she carefully pulled them off the shelf and settled on the floor, cross-legged, her flashlight casting a warm glow over the yellowed pages. As she leafed through the newspapers, Ava felt as though she was reaching across time, touching the lives of the students who had walked these same hallways generations before. Each headline, each photograph, and each article gave her a glimpse into the past. But it wasn't until she reached the thin, tattered issue from the spring of 1968 that she found what she had been looking for. Her breath caught as her eyes fell on a bold, simple headline splashed across the top of the page: Student Protest Held at Lincoln High. The accompanying article was short, the language carefully chosen, but the details sent a chill down Ava's spine. According to the piece, a group of students, led by none other than Clara Rivers, had organized a peaceful protest to address the racial injustices happening within the school. Clara had rallied her classmates, speaking passionately about the need for equality and demanding that the administration address the systemic discrimination that black students were facing. Her speech had drawn a large crowd, and the protest was meant to be a turning point for the school. But the article abruptly ended, without any mention of what followed or what had become of Clara's efforts. Ava turned the page, hoping to find more, but there was nothing. It was as though the story had been intentionally cut short, leaving Clara's protest to fade into obscurity, hidden among the forgotten issues in the school's archives. Ava's heart ached as she traced her fingers over the words. She could almost see Clara standing before her classmates, her voice unwavering, her passion igniting a spark of hope in those who had felt voiceless. The image was vivid in Ava's mind, a vision of Clara as more than just a name in an article or a face in an old photograph. She was a living, breathing force for change, a young woman who had dared to stand up for justice even when the world was stacked against her. But then, in the same folder, Ava found something else, a crumpled, typewritten note buried between the pages, yellowed with age. As she unfolded it, her heart raced at the sight of the familiar symbol at the bottom, a hand holding a pen. It was Clara's. The note read, "They tried to silence us today. But silence is not the same as defeat. They can hide our voices, but they can't erase the truth. Someday, someone will find this. They'll know what happened here. And maybe they'll pick up where we left off." Ava felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. Clara's words were both a warning and a message of hope, a testament to the strength and resilience that had defined her. Ava could almost hear Clara's voice, steady and fierce, telling her that she was not alone in her fight, that others had come before her and others would come after. The note was a reminder of the power of history, of the stories that refused to die, even when they were pushed to the edges of memory. In that moment, Ava's frustration and sadness transformed into a fierce determination. Clara had sacrificed so much, risked her safety and her future, all to stand up for a cause she believed in. And here she was, decades later, her story reduced to a dusty box in a forgotten storage room, erased from the very school she had fought to change. Ava knew what she had to do. She couldn't let Clara's story end here, buried in the shadows. She couldn't let Mr. Wallace, Principal Reed, or anyone else keep her from bringing the truth to light. Clara's words had sparked something within her, a fire that couldn't be extinguished. This wasn't just about a history project anymore. This was about justice, about honoring the legacy of a young woman who had refused to be silenced. With renewed resolve, Ava carefully folded the note and tucked it into her pocket. She knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. She would face more resistance, more attempts to silence her. But now she felt Clara's spirit beside her, guiding her, urging her forward. She wasn't just telling Clara's story. She was continuing it, carrying her voice into the present and giving it the platform it had always deserved. As Ava left the archive that night, she felt a profound sense of purpose, a weight lifted from her shoulders. She wasn't afraid anymore. The fear and doubt that had plagued her had been replaced by a quiet, powerful resolve. She would share Clara's story, no matter the cost, and ensure that her voice was finally heard. The following week, Ava took the first step in her mission to bring Clara's story into the light. She organized a presentation for the school's history club, inviting students and teachers alike to attend. She even extended a personal invitation to Mr. Wallace, hoping that he might come to understand the importance of this story. Her friends rallied around her, helping her prepare, offering their support and encouragement. They knew the significance of what she was doing, and they stood beside her every step of the way. When the day of the presentation arrived, Ava felt a mixture of nerves and excitement as she stood before the small crowd that had gathered in the school auditorium. She held Clara's note in her hand, a tangible reminder of the woman who had started this journey so many years ago. Taking a deep breath, Ava began to speak, her voice steady and clear. She told the story of Clara Rivers, the young activist who had dared to stand up for justice in a time when it was dangerous to do so. She shared the details of the protest, the courage Clara had shown, and the sacrifices she had made. As she spoke, she felt a deep connection to Clara, a sense that they were united across time, bound by a shared purpose. The audience listened in silence, captivated by Clara's story. Even Mr. Wallace, who had initially dismissed Ava's project, seemed moved, his expression softening as he realized the gravity of what Clara had endured. By the time Ava finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. As the applause filled the auditorium, Ava felt a sense of fulfillment she had never experienced before. She had done it. She had given Clara's story the voice it deserved, and in doing so, she had found her own. That night, as Ava walked home, she looked up at the stars, feeling a quiet sense of peace. Clara's story was finally out in the open, no longer hidden in the shadows, and Ava knew that, in some small way, she had helped to keep Clara's legacy alive, honoring her memory and ensuring that her voice would continue to inspire others for generations to come. In that moment, Ava understood the true power of history, the way it could shape lives, bridge divides, and bring justice to those who had been forgotten. She had found her purpose, her calling, and she knew that she would carry Clara's story with her, a reminder of the strength that came from standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. On the day of the annual history fair, the school auditorium was abuzz with students, parents, and teachers, all eager to see the projects and presentations that would showcase their community's history. Ava stood near the stage, her heart racing as she glanced over her setup. An array of carefully chosen photographs, letters, and yellowed newspaper clippings, each piece a glimpse into the life and legacy of Clara Rivers. This was the culmination of months of research, late nights, and quiet resolve. Today, Clara's story would finally be shared. As the crowd settled, Ava took her place at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. She looked out over the audience, catching the supportive smiles of her friends, her grandmother's encouraging nod, and the curious expressions of students and teachers alike. Even Mr. Wallace was there, standing at the back of the auditorium, his face unreadable. Ava drew a deep breath and began. She started by introducing Clara Rivers, a former student of Lincoln High who, in the 1960s, had taken a bold stand against the racial injustices that plagued her school and community. As Ava spoke, she could see the surprise on her classmates' faces, a mix of admiration and sadness as they learned of the challenges Clara had faced. Ava explained how Clara had organized a peaceful protest at the very school they all now attended, demanding change in a time when standing up for one's beliefs was met with hostility and even danger. As Ava unveiled the photographs and clippings, her voice grew stronger. She described Clara's courage, her passion, and her determination to make a difference, even when it meant facing threats and intimidation. With each word, Ava felt the weight of Clara's story lifting, her voice carrying Clara's memory forward, honoring her in a way she never had the chance to be honored in her own time. But then, Ava paused. It was time for the truth about the cover-up, the silencing of Clara's protest by the very institution that should have celebrated her courage. She spoke of the newspaper article that had ended abruptly, the missing records, the erased history. The room fell silent, the tension settling over the crowd as they listened, captivated and horrified by the revelation. Ava felt her pulse quicken, but she continued, knowing this was the truth Clara had entrusted her to tell. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mr. Wallace stepped forward. He looked at Ava, a mix of regret and respect in his eyes, before he turned to address the audience. His voice was steady, yet heavy with emotion as he admitted his own role in perpetuating the silence around Clara's story. He had been a young teacher back then, following orders, never questioning the decisions made by those in power. But today, he understood that his silence had been a form of complicity, a betrayal of the very ideals he had once hoped to instill in his students. "I was wrong," Mr. Wallace said, his voice breaking slightly. "I failed Clara Rivers and everyone who could have been inspired by her courage. And for that, I am truly sorry. Her story deserves to be told. Her legacy deserves to be honored. And it is Ava who has taught us all the importance of remembering, of learning from the past so we don't repeat it." His words hung in the air, resonating with the audience. There was a palpable sense of release, of healing, as Mr. Wallace's apology added a layer of redemption to Clara's story, a recognition of the pain she had endured and the bravery she had shown. Ava watched as her classmates nodded, some wiping tears from their eyes, moved by the weight of the moment. It was as if the silence that had once surrounded Clara's story had finally been broken, replaced by an acknowledgement that would echo long after this day. As the history fair continued, people came forward to read the letters and articles, some touching the photos of Clara as if reaching out to her through time. By the end of the evening, the principal stepped onto the stage and announced that the school would be installing a plaque in Clara Rivers' honor, a permanent tribute that would remind future generations of her legacy. The room erupted in applause, a mix of pride, respect, and relief, as if a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. When the crowd dispersed and the auditorium emptied, Ava lingered by the display. She ran her fingers over Clara's letters, feeling the deep connection to the young woman who had once walked these same halls. She thought of her grandmother's words, of Clara's letter, and of the incredible journey that had brought her here. Clara's voice, once silenced, had found its way through the decades, carried forward by Ava's determination. As she turned to leave, she noticed Mr. Wallace standing nearby. He approached her, his expression softer, humbled. "Ava," he said, pausing as if searching for the right words. "Thank you. For everything. You've reminded me, and all of us, of the importance of courage and truth. Clara would be proud." Ava smiled, her heart full. She had done it. She had brought justice to Clara's name, uncovered a forgotten legacy, and, in the process, inspired her school to confront its past and honor those who had come before. And as she walked out of the auditorium, she felt a sense of peace and purpose, knowing that Clara's story would live on. That night, Ava looked up at the stars, feeling Clara's presence beside her, a quiet strength that filled her with hope. Clara's legacy was no longer hidden in dusty archives. It was a living memory, a testament to resilience and the power of speaking out. In honoring Clara, Ava had forged her own path, creating a bridge to connect past and present, a reminder that some stories, once uncovered, could change the world. And from that day forward, as students passed by the plaque dedicated to Clara Rivers, they would see her story, a symbol of resilience, redemption, and the importance of remembering the past. Ava knew that, no matter where life took her, Clara's spirit would always be with her, a guiding light in the journey ahead.